The last time I paid 50 Hong Kong dollars for such morally indefensible manipulation, I was on a massage table. Hi, welcome to the Silver Spleen. My name is Joey Buttafuoco, and this is my review of The Crossing Part 2. The Crossing, both parts, is based on the true story of the sinking of the Taiping, a Chinese steamer that sank off the coast of Taiwan. As the title cards tell us, of the more than 1,500 passengers on board, less than 50 survived. I say all of that to remind you that there is a real-life tragedy at the center of The Crossing. Part 2 opens with a sort of John Woo trademark. I say sort of because there are birds, but they're not doves, they're seagulls. They're also CGI, but so is the ship that they're flying over, and the harbor that the ship is going into. That doesn't bother me though, because real ships and real harbors are grossly expensive, and seagulls are notoriously hard to train, from what I've read. John Woo's iconic doves do show up later in the film, and they are real, but they show up in the middle of a sex scene. And that's weird and unsettling. And that's me saying that. But never mind. Part 1 of The Crossing ended with what amounts to a preview of Part 2, and it gave away some things that it shouldn't. So, going into Part 2, I already knew too much about the 3 most important narrative arcs in the film. But by the time I actually got to see Part 2, I couldn't remember the specifics. I just remembered that the preview gave a lot of things away. Part 1 was released in Hong Kong in Christmas of 2014. At that time, Part 2 was slated for release in May of 2015. It's now October. But hey, what's 5 months to a middle-aged memory? Besides, like Titanic, we all knew the ship was going to sink, so there really weren't any surprises. But The Crossing doesn't do anything to help itself either. Taken as a whole, it's a 4-hour movie. The sinking doesn't occur well into hour 3. Admittedly, that's only hour 2 of part 2, but it still felt like it took forever. Part of the reason it took forever is the exhaustive approach to 3 love stories. Or should I say exhausting? Even I knew it was wrong to be sitting in the cinema muttering, "All right already, just sink the damn ship, will you?" It seemed like John Woo spent an awful lot of time showing us how tragic these people's lives were before some of them got on the boat. There are a lot of overstated, implausible coincidences, some cinematically useful but wholly unrealistic monologues, and too much convenience, contrivance, and melodrama. Instead of creating dramatic tension, it just felt like cheap, smothering manipulation. So by the time the ship started sinking, it came across as just another setback in these ridiculously hard lives. I don't like saying that, but I didn't like thinking or feeling it either. I really didn't want to have this many problems with this movie, I really didn't. But as long as we're talking about problems, some characters I couldn't remember, probably because of the 10-month gap between Part 1 and Part 2. For other characters, I was forced to remember because it felt like some scenes from Part 1 were replayed in their entirety. Like I said, it's unfortunate that I ended up feeling that way because there's some very good acting in this movie. Takeshi Kaneshiro is really good, playing a character with an ethnic and cultural background nearly identical to his own. Zhang is also very believable and watchable as a woman who needs to get to Taiwan to find her long-lost love. One thing I did like about Part 2 of The Crossing is that Huang Xiaoming's character was only in it for a flashback or two. Speaking of flashbacks, it was nice that in Part 2 I didn't have to see Takeshi Kaneshiro in a student uniform too much, because he's over 40. He's not very convincing as a student, just as an adult. That's not something I can say for Song Hye-kyo, the Korean actress who plays Huang Xiaoming's Chinese wife. She's overdubbed and spends most of the movie with a blank look on her face. I suppose there's a plastic surgery joke to be made, but I've already brought up Huang Xiaoming, so let's move along. Speaking of plastic surgery and other issues of facial appearance, shooting movies in high-definition video means that makeup has to change. In movies set in the past, like this one, it doesn't matter as much because makeup was heavier and more obvious in the late 1940s, but only women wore makeup back then. And as long as we're finding fault with the production, maritime collisions don't take place at high speed. I realize it's more dramatically compelling to have the ships moving that fast, but if you know anything about ships, it just looks silly and painfully unrealistic. Speaking of dramatically compelling and unrealistic, I realize that this is becoming something of a dead horse for me. But you can't see underwater in the ocean at night. There's a whole lot of this movie that just feels superfluous, and there's an awful lot of screen time that feels, narratively speaking, like treading water. Pardon the pun. I felt bad thinking that, but not bad enough to not make that joke, because it feels disingenuous or disrespectful to the real historical event. Even I know it's wrong for me to feel impatient or like I was just waiting for the ship to start sinking. Which does eventually happen, but by that point in the movie, it's almost perfunctory. Once the collision occurs, the crossing ends up seeming an awful lot like a Chinese version of Titanic. Can I say Titanic? Does that make me a bad person? Sure, it's disrespectful to the victims, but so is using their deaths as an excuse for a 4-hour slog through a maudlin melodramatic exercise in emotional manipulation. The crossing is crassly melodramatic and manipulative and exploitative. It's also grossly predictable. I knew exactly when the collision would take place based on the dialogue. I literally said, and boom. And there it was. I'm sure you could do it too if you watch the movie, which I cannot in good conscience recommend that you do. If you want to see it, go to the cinema. Try and watch it on a big screen. It was intended to be very blockbuster-ish, so that's probably the best way to see it. But don't steal this movie. If you don't see it in the cinema, wait till you can rent it or buy a disc. Don't steal it. When the movie gets released to home video, I'll update the description with a link where you could buy a disc. If you enjoyed the review, please tell me. If you didn't, tell me. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoy the channel, please subscribe. See you again soon.